Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we will be continuing to read Out of the Shadows, Reimagining Gay Men's Lives by Walt Odets. We're going to continue Some Obstructions to Self-Discovery, Isolation, the Story of Sean. In gay communities today, isolation is endemic for both older and younger men. And like diagnosis, it is a significant impediment to recovery from trauma and loss. Unfortunately, gay people often grow up in isolation, and this is still true today because of the rejection and abuse that young gay people continue to experience from families, peers, and communities. Gay adolescents are still actively discouraged or prohibited from developing potentially meaningful, intimate relationships, and as adults, often do not know how to relate intimately to others. As children and adolescents, and sometimes as adults, we hide ourselves to avoid detection, reduce our sense of shame, and protect ourselves from potential hostility. For someone who feels unwanted or contemptible, isolation is safety. While it is usually the only implementable option for children and adolescents, it is too often sustained into adult life, and the emotional aftermaths of the early and continuing late epidemics have layered themselves on top of the trauma and isolation first experienced in growing up gay. On the surface, the self-isolation of a trauma survivor makes little sense, for we would expect them to seek much-needed social connection and support. But isolation is an almost invariable consequence of any trauma, for trauma damages our inborn capacity for attachments to others. Survivors isolate themselves when others and the world feel dangerous, and when they feel a need to protect and hide an injured sense of self, a sense of self that is often further restricted by the stigma of diagnosis. The idea that one has PTSD helps codify a survivor's isolation. Isolation is not a direct response to trauma, but a product of the feelings that are a direct response. These feelings commonly include fear, anxiety, depression, shame, a sense of a fragmented or damaged self, and the loss of trust in oneself and the world. In remaining isolated during a gay adolescence or an epidemic and its aftermath, the survivor is attempting to protect himself and to conceal and cope with feelings. Unfortunately, the isolation also disconnects him from the social, interpersonal, and professional support that might help him emerge from the aftermath of trauma. Even as isolation is only a marker of underlying reactions to trauma, it often exacerbates those reactions. Isolation creates its own secondary problems, particularly when it becomes an extended form of life. Despite such secondary problems, we still cannot address isolation without first exploring the direct symptoms of trauma that lie behind it. Because isolation is a visible marker, it is often the only sign of a problem that an outsider, including a psychotherapist, sees, and it may be the only sign that the survivor himself is conscious of or acknowledges to others. Our first useful step is to note the isolation. Our second, to remember that isolation conceals other feelings that need exploring before the isolation, and any of its secondary problems are addressed. By nature, few human beings become spontaneously or willfully isolated, and the helpful solution rarely lies in addressing the isolation alone. The isolation of older gay men in response to the early epidemic has taken many forms. During those years, some older group men fled the danger and chaos by leaving gay communities for other locales, many of them unsupportive of gay life. Some men who had never entered gay communities remained isolated where they were, often unhappy, avoiding the entire issue of coming out. Rather than flee geographically, some men who lived in gay communities remained physically within them, but adjusted their social lives to emulate the isolated lives that they had first known as adolescents. Some men fled into seemingly safe relationships that they would not otherwise have pursued, often resulting in two isolated men living together under a single roof. The psychological stress of life in the early epidemic encouraged many forms of exodus, all driven by fear, shame, emotional exhaustion, and the sense of a loss of community. and of self. For those living through the epidemic with their own HIV infection and the stigma attached to it, those with accumulating losses, and those otherwise experiencing trauma, the relational self, the self they had previously brought to social and intimate relationships, often felt injured or lost. In the words of Judith Herman, the long-standing dean of the literature on trauma, the traumatic event destroys the belief that one can be oneself in relation to others. As one isolated man told me in 1992, "I can't be around people anymore. I don't know what happened, but I can't, and I don't see how to be different." In the years following the early epidemic, it was not just individuals, but entire communities that no longer seemed what they had been. Gay communities were long past the broad, unifying spirit of post-Stonewall gay liberation and were no longer united by the common purpose of the epidemic's emergency. Indeed, gay men were seeming to deny that the epidemic had ever happened, because no one wanted to revisit the trauma in conversation with others, for fear of opening up a discussion too painful to revisit, and re-traumatizing everyone involved. Living in now socially and politically incoherent communities, a fragmentation that is particularly destructive within stigmatized minority communities, many gay men felt that they had moved back to Kansas, where they had no community and did not belong. As in childhood and adolescent years, these men were again outsiders and alone, scattered emotionally, sometimes literally, to distant corners. Speaking more broadly about the effects of trauma, Herman usefully describes some of the psychological forces behind the disintegration of gay communities following the early epidemic. Traumatic events have primary effects not only on the psychological structure of the self, but also on the system of attachment and meaning that link individual and community. Traumatic events destroy the victim's fundamental assumptions about the safety of the world, the positive value of the self, and the meaningful order of creation. The isolation of young men today is rooted in a constellation of influences that are significantly different from those faced by older gay men. Some are familiar and shared with older men, including the early life experience of outsiderness and isolation that so easily turns an experience of transitory circumstance into a self-identity that is carried into adulthood, and fear and avoidance of HIV, today realistic or not, and the isolating effect of stigma directed at HIV-positive men. But other influences on young men are less familiar to older men, and oddly, many of these are a legacy of the early epidemic that older men lived through but young men never knew. The social and psychological aftermath of the early epidemic is very different for older and younger men. While a middle group of men straddles this distinction, older men knew the experience of being gay in relatively coherent gay communities before the epidemic began. Young men have come out into the post-epidemic, fragmented minority communities that I discussed in Chapter 3, communities in which some men strive for a post-trauma normalization of gay lives that others abhor and reject. Some now older survivors did emerge from the epidemic still focused on earlier personal and social agendas, but others, particularly middle-aged and older men with money and influence, have sought the ease of security of assimilation into the larger society. This fragmented legacy has been handed to young men who have no first-hand knowledge of the earlier, youth-driven history of gay life in America, a history that describes communities first united by necessary secrecy, then publicly voiced homophile and liberation movements, and finally the truly desperate to the death battle against HIV. The only gay communities young men have known no longer have such coherent purpose, and with the proliferation of gay people in the public eye, also a result of the early epidemic, young men are finding that their being gay is, pure sex aside, little to have in common. For some men, even gay self-identity, which is strengthened by adversity and outsiderness, is no longer as defined in an American society that is slowly moving toward greater acceptance. Minority groups naturally strive to define themselves, for the individual self-identity is partly built on that definition. Young men are, in a way that older men circumvented with ready-made community purpose, thus required to build from scratch meaningful communities that provide a sense of self rooted in a sense of belonging. Unfortunately, young men today usually share older gay men's socially enforced deprivation of early developmental experience that might assist that effort. In my experience, too many young men today feel that they were forced outside in early life and are being forced out again with no home to return to. As one intelligent, Indiana-born 27-year-old put it to me, I came to San Francisco to finally find a gay life, and I've found almost nothing. During the early epidemic, gay men began paying significantly more attention to physical fitness and an appearance of health. The epidemic offered the never-to-be-forgotten experience of wasting, disfigurement, and death for hundreds of thousands of young and middle-aged men. The psychologist Brett Kennedy has had a partial focus on body image disorders among gay men, and in a recent email, he described to me his perception of the evolution of such concerns among gay men, concerns that are today apparent. In my psychology practice, during the 90s and early 2000s, as treatments improved for HIV-positive men, including testosterone and steroids for muscle wasting, many positive men no longer appear sick, and an overly muscled, healthy look was becoming an aesthetic. So I was seeing a lot of HIV-negative men use testosterone and steroids to measure up to the HIV-positive men who now had this advantage. During this time, especially in the Castro, New York, and LA, the muscled aesthetic became the ideal, as it conveyed not only health, but a caricatured masculinity as well. This body aesthetic has changed somewhat over the years, and men are now opting for a lean and light body, but they continue to use different concoctions of steroids to achieve the bodies of choice. In the mid-2000s, especially in New York, I regularly worked in my practice with gay men with body image issues who were attempting to modify their bodies with steroids and over-exercising. It seems to me that this crisis of our bodies really started and is rooted in the impact of HIV and fear of looking sick, competing with those who have HIV and issues about masculinity. Obviously, culture has changed as well into a more health-conscious society that is more focused on physical aesthetics and plastic surgery. So even without direct connections to the epidemic, young gays are seeing older gay men and their bodies, and they're just trying to compete in a competitive world. The attention to physical appearance has supported a level of objectification, the experience of others as objects rather than people, among gay men that did not exist before the early epidemic. Objectification has an important consequence for isolation. It encourages physical interaction with other things to the exclusion of intellectual and emotional intimacy, and a lack of intimacy in one's life, or an internal incapacity for intimacy, is a consequence and a cause of isolation. Particularly among today's young gay men, objectification has found an important ally in internet sites and phone apps. Both offer illustrated shopping catalogs of available men, not unlike mail-order shoe catalogs or the illustrated menus of Japanese restaurants. If one does not like a particular pair of Oxfords or the tuna sushi, he need only turn the page, and the apps are thus particularly appealing to men who are isolated or uncomfortable with socializing, even as they do little to address those limitations. Because of phone app use, there is now much less personal face-to-face contact in live gay venues such as gay community centers, support groups, clubs, or bars. Scruff promises to help its users meet millions of scruff gay guys in your neighborhood and around the world. Grindr allows a man to search by tribe to find your type of guy and narrow down guys with a filter feature. Tribe refers to classified groups such as twinks, young and slender, bears, older, stout and hairy, cubs, younger and stout, gym bunnies, toned or muscled, geeks, too busy with other matters to be concerned about appearance and socially awkward, or discreet, surreptitious and perhaps not out. This is not an exhaustive list. but it is noteworthy that all but the last group are defined by objectifying physical characteristics. Each subscriber is optionally allowed to categorize themselves for the benefit of other searches, and within any given tribe, one can refine the search with additional filters. Filterable information may include preferred sexual acts, amount of body hair, penis size, circumcision or the lack of it, and HIV status, so one could presumably search for an HIV-negative, uncircumcised Jim Bunny top. But who is that as a person? The appeal of apps is partly rooted in male sexuality, not just gay male sexuality, in its most pragmatic, least relational expression. The app experience thus revisits the unhappy, non-relational, and isolated adolescent experience of many gay men, an adolescence that American society has almost universally insisted on. While as adults, many with fulfilled lives use the apps largely for recreational hookups, a majority of men use them to address isolation and the lack of intimacy. They are looking for something substantial and important. But for every connection that truly grows into something meaningful, thousands are merely objectifying and thus disappointing. Resources such as phone apps certainly have huge potential, and that potential is sometimes realized. But young men too often tell me that they are isolated by the technology that constructs their social lives. There's a difference between meeting someone on an app through agile thumbs and truncated sentences, and the traditional alternative of sitting together, talking, and having a drink. In San Francisco's Castro district, one often sees young men milling past one another on the street or sitting in bars and cafes, with a majority focused on their phones, rather than one another. Many of these men are using the apps in the hope of emerging from their isolation, but when a meeting does result, one could easily imagine that the app's objectifying structure begets objectified, non-relational sex that largely replicates the unfulfilling, lonely adolescent experience. In his email to me, Brad Kennedy also commented on the history and effects of technology. Online dating was the first step, and then as technology advanced, GPS became integrated into the apps, and the ease with which one could get laid increased exponentially. And, I would posit, intimacy was impaired. Many of my young clients will discuss wanting a boyfriend or relationship, but struggle with their own attention span and with how to engage another person in a more intimate way. I see people creating rules to facilitate intimacy. For example, going on an old school date to dinner and not sleeping with them, trying to hold off on sex to build on the relationship. I remember one guy who was doing this, and he was so excited about someone he'd met and telling me about their first date. I remarked that he must be excited about the second date, and he said, "Well, on my way home from dinner, I logged into Grindr and hooked up with someone, and then I wasn't so sure if the guy from dinner was really that great, or if it was really worth it when it's so easy to get on Grindr and have so many options, depending on your mood." Phone apps have certainly not caused the difficulty that contemporary young men are having with intimacy and isolation, but the apps probably exacerbate it. They, too, easily bring to adult lives the early developmental experience of craving, but rarely finding, authentic connections to others. If the adolescent had only a handful of self-made fantasies about connection, the apps offer an implausible million or more for the isolated adult to page through. For those pages that lead to a face-to-face meeting, a large majority end in objectified sex. But men seeking others are usually seeking more than the release of young male libido. They are seeking emotional connection to others and, in those connections, discovery of themselves, and, possibly, enduring relationships. Purely objectified sex is not a probable path to such objectives. As we have seen from adolescence forward, gay men have been societally defined by the idea of the homosexual, which entirely characterizes gay life by its sexual acts. Societal characterizations readily become a self-identity, and it is significantly the identity of the homosexual that we see expressed by young men today. They are more sexually active than any generation since that of the 1970s gay liberation. As one young man who was unhappy with his social life in San Francisco put it to me, most of the guys I meet would fuck a coconut. The active sexual lives of young men are supported by the pharmaceutical control of HIV, which often allows sex with relatively little risk of HIV infection, and young men are understandably pushing back against early life constraints. Young men often feel that older gay men had access to birthright of sexual freedom that today's young men have been deprived of, and they often feel that the early epidemic and the role that older men played in it were responsible for that deprivation. Their feelings are understandable, and young men should explore sexually, but one wonders how their sexual lives leave them feeling. Too many young men today are puzzled by the idea that human intimacy is important, an intimacy that is also a human birthright, whether young men know it or not. Without this understanding, young men may be on trajectories that will only sustain and deepen the perpetual sense of isolation and unrequited longing they knew in adolescence. Sean's story provides insight into the isolation that often follows trauma, in this instance, the trauma of the early epidemic. Sean, 54, had contracted HIV in his early 20s, but did not know it until several years later. He was an intelligent, ambitious, and independent. In his 20s, he had completed a graduate degree in electrical engineering and had, at age 27, started his own company, specializing in redundant high-speed electronic switching. Like many I've seen in therapy following the early epidemic, Sean felt that the problem he wanted to talk about was isolation and loneliness. The following transcript is an extreme condensation of many months of conversation. When I found out I had HIV, I remember thinking, this is what rape must feel like. My body wasn't mine. It had been taken over by somebody who was going to kill me. A year after I got the diagnosis, I was crapping in my pants and vomiting 5 times a day. And all of that is completely humiliating. I was 29 when I started getting sick, and I've never gotten over that feeling of losing control. Even now, I don't trust people. If I'm near someone who has a cold, I feel like, don't touch me, don't get near me. I don't want you inside me. But you trust yourself? I asked. Yes, Sean hesitated a moment. No, I'd say no, and I don't know how this fits in. But when you ask the question, I say I don't trust myself either, not with people. Well, I'm imagining that you came out of that humiliating experience with certain feelings about yourself, feelings that undercut your self-confidence. Well, I felt like a pariah then, and I still feel like one. So now that you're bringing it up, I think it works both ways. Don't touch me, and I won't touch you. That's how it works. It works both ways. Right now, I don't know if it's trust of other people, or I just feel ashamed of myself. Is being ashamed distrust of myself? This is confused in my mind. Ashamed of yourself for what? For everything, I guess. Getting HIV, shitting my pants for 2 years, everything. When I was a kid, in my 20s, I trusted people. That's part of the story about how I got HIV. I don't know how to put it, but the whole thing, the epidemic and my having HIV, all left me helpless in some way. I'm ashamed of that. I work hard, I'm smart, I have a successful company. Did I tell you that we got the contract for some of the control switching on the Boeing 787? Congratulations, but no, I don't remember you mentioning it. You look at me and think that HIV had no effect on my life after the antiviral drug cocktail, but the truth is that I do feel helpless in some way that I haven't been aware of. Being ashamed of myself, is that a lack of self-trust? Well, I don't think shame supports self-confidence, and reasonable self-confidence seems like a prerequisite to self-trust. So yes, I'd say that shame and self-trust are connected in some way. And to return to why you first came to see me, I can't imagine that shame and helplessness are things you would experience as a good foundation for working on your sense of isolation. Sean started laughing. Hardly. I've never made that connection before, which is weird because it's obvious when you say it. I'll have to think about it, but I'd never made it. Hi, I'm Sean and I'm ashamed and helpless and I'd like to be your friend. Sounds good, right? Not really. No, not really. I'm a different person now than I was then, in 83 or whatever. I'm an ashamed and helpless person, and I don't know who I'd be with anyone new in my life. I don't know who I could be. As I am now, I don't like me, so why would anyone else? I'm ashamed and helpless, and I'd like to be your friend. With your simple questions, I realize that I've lost myself. And in doing that, you've lost a sense of a personal or larger community. Yes, exactly. I don't even know who I am. How would I know who I would be in a relationship, even a social one? It would be a lie from the beginning. The feelings that had underlain Sean's isolation were not known to him. After contracting HIV, he had isolated himself with a purely unconscious sense of shame and helplessness. He felt too damaged or too non-existent to allow social or intimate connections, the very connections that might have helped him emerge from the unhappy personal life he had hidden from himself and others, behind an addictive and successful work life. While Sean's isolation was substantially a product of those feelings of shame and helplessness, the isolation had exacerbated the feelings, for he was now also ashamed of the isolation itself. In continuing our work together, we would make another important discovery. Sean's impulse to isolate himself started long before he contracted HIV, at the age of 12, when he overheard his parents talking in the kitchen about whether Sean was gay. There's one thing that sticks in my mind, Sean told me, which is when my dad said, I would rather have a dead son than a gay one. And then my mom said nothing. At that moment, Sean knew for the first time with absolute certainty that he had to hide himself from others. The epidemic and his HIV infection had only perpetuated the plan. The aftermath of the trauma of the two epidemics and that of the day in, day out extended trauma of gay early life experience have something in common. Connection or reconnection to others is an essential step on the path to discovering or rediscovering happier lives that do not remain defined by the emotional aftermath of the trauma. As I will discuss in Chapter 6, coming out of isolation is a crucial last step in working through a post-trauma experience. While the exploration of underlying emotional issues that Sean and I engaged in often feel as if it worsens isolation, and it often does in the short term, the exploration is unavoidable. The alternative, jumping directly to the effort to correct isolation itself, is too likely to result in an inauthentic, internally constricted life that is usually not capable of authentic connection or intimacy. Such a life is capable of apparent connectedness if that, on the aftermath of trauma, the reluctance to examine feelings and isolation, Judith Herman provides a succinct description. Because reliving a traumatic experience by talking about it provokes such intense emotional distress, traumatized people go to great lengths to avoid it. The effort to ward off intrusive symptoms, though self-protective in intent, further aggravates the post-traumatic syndrome, for the attempt to avoid reliving the trauma too often results in a narrowing of consciousness, a withdrawal from engagement with others, and an impoverished life.